Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field. One will be taken, one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together. One will be taken, and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this. If the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The Gospel of the Lord. I heard this reading today, and it made me think of my first year in seminary, my first fall, actually. It was December. And for any students in the room, as December rolls around, you get very busy, right? You get a lot of work due, so you're staying up all night, you're burning midnight oil, so to speak. And so I was working on this paper, and I've been doing it for like 4 hours or so. And I decided I need to take a break. So I went out, out of my door, and down to there was like a common area down the hallway, and there was like a kitchenette, and usually there'd be like some food on the tables, and usually people who are trying to like take their minds off their work or just plain procrastinate would sit out there and chat with one another. And I saw this one woman who lived across the hall from me, and she was she was a really stoic type person, very serious, a very good student, but one of those people that you would meet and you try and have a conversation and it would be sort of weird, who's like really smart but sort of socially awkward. And so here she was sitting in this chair, and I come down the hall and I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this right now. But I decided to anyway because I needed to get away from my paper. So I was like, hey Julie, what's going on? And she's like, oh, nothing's going on. How are you? And she was like all giddy and excited. And I was like, what? What's she so excited about? And I was like, so what are you doing up here? And she's like, well, I'm just sitting around enjoying the night or something like that. I was like, oh, that's really strange. So I said, well, I'll just start talking about what I'm doing on my paper. And as I started to talk, she cut me off. And she's like, you know what? I think I need to go outside right now. And I was like, what? Because she was in her pajamas. And this is December. So this is weird. And so she, I was like, well, maybe you shouldn't. And she just gets up and goes to the stairs, goes down, heads outside. And so I was just sitting there, like, kind of dumbfounded by all this. And I'm like, why would you go outside in your PJs and little lambs and all that stuff? I mean, it's cold. And, so I'm like, all right, I gotta go outside and see what's going on here. So I go to the stairs, and as I open the door, she's coming back already. And I'm like, oh, you're coming back? Was it too cold? And, and she just sort of pushes by me, like, pushes my shoulder out of the way, walks by. And so I sort of follow her down the hall and, like, watch. She's going down the hall, and she just goes to her room, opens the door, closes it, locks it. And then that was it. I didn't hear from her the rest of the night. And so I was like, oh, that's weird. And so I went back to my room, finished my paper, and then, went to sleep, got up the next morning, and I ran into her, and I was like, oh, do you remember going outside? How was it? Was it cold? And she sort of looked at me, like, crossly, and was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then she just, brushes by again, and off she goes to class, because that's who she was. She was a very dedicated student. Didn't have time to talk to people usually. And so, I was relatively new in the community. I hadn't met everybody, and I talked to her friend, and I was like, what's up with Julie? I mean, she just sort of, went outside in her PJs last night and didn't care less about it. And she's like, oh, and she's like, usually Julie locks herself in her room. She sleepwalks. And what happens with her is that she actually unconsciously walks around, has interactions, apparently assumes a different personality to a certain extent, and has no memory of this. So what she does is she bolts herself in her room, usually. And so she forgot to do it that night, probably because she was tired or something like that. And the reason I think about this sort of strange sleepwalking anecdote is because that's what Jesus is sort of saying to us today, isn't he? I mean, he's saying, wake up, folks. That's what we like walk by like as zombies, right? Like not quite like that. We're somehow or other we're sleepwalking, is what he's saying. And what is he talking about? disciples, right? The gospel text that we heard today was a couple days before the Last Supper and then the Garden of Gethsemane, where what happens? The disciples fall asleep after Jesus tells them to stay awake. And then a day or two after that, there's the crucifixion, and the disciples sort of run away because they're afraid. Even though Jesus is like, I'm coming back, I will be resurrected. Fear. They doubt. So if it was hard for the disciples to stay awake, it's probably going to be even harder for us, right? Because here we are 2,000 years later, and, there's a huge push on Christmas and Thanksgiving to be about something else, right? It's about buying gifts or consumerism or all these other things come rushing at us, like so much so that Thanksgiving stores opened early on Thanksgiving. I was at the chiropractor the other day, and his brother has a daughter who is autistic, and she likes to go to the stores as soon as they open on Black Friday, particularly Target. She just loves to go there and roam around. So they would get up every Black Friday and go in the morning. But this year, Target opened at 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving night. So when she saw the ads, she's like, "Oh, Dad, we gotta go." So he's like, "All right, we've got to go." So they went after the Thanksgiving meal. They went to Target, and she roamed around and probably picked out a couple things. But there's a huge press on us now to think about other things other than Christ. And then today we hear about Christ coming again, the second coming of Christ. And this thing is even stranger, right? Because if Jesus said he was coming quickly or soon 2,000 years ago, here we are 2,000 years later, and we're like, it's pretty easy to fall asleep when you make it 2,000 years, isn't it? So how long do we wait, right? And I think that this second coming, though, in Advent really means something else. It means that God promises to come back for you and I. So what could that possibly mean? The way I understand it is that there's something more for us, not only after death, but in this life. There's something more for us than simply buying gifts and giving them to people. Or there's even more for us for not having enough money to buy the gifts that we want to give to people and then feel bad about it. There's more for us than being alone in a holiday season that all families and loved ones get together and for whatever reason we can't. There's more for us in God and the promises that God makes to us. Because God says God's going to come back for us. But there's sort of this other vision of what the second coming it means today, right? I mean, you often hear of the Left Behind series, and if you've ever seen the movies with Kirk Cameron, I've talked about it before, and everybody gets raptured away and taken away, and then, and everybody left is damned forever. And I think, this is a popular image that we have, and I think there are a couple different ways to look at the second coming of Christ. And I guess the first way to think about it is this. I used to work as a financial advisor, so I worked for a broker-dealer named Ameriprise Financial, and the governing body that governs broker-dealers is the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC. And the SEC can just show up at your office whenever they want. They're just that they can do an audit your books whenever they want. And so one day at Ameriprise, I was doing my business, calling, tons of people, trying to schedule appointments. And, these two gentlemen walk in, really nice suits. They obviously weren't clients. They have big briefcases, and they just sort of walk right past the secretary and right into the president's office. And everybody in the office, they're starting to look around and they're like, this isn't good. And so the president comes out and she says that there are representatives from the SEC here. They're going to ask for any client files that you have, and they're going to go through all your drawers, and they're going to go through all the stuff you have and see if everything makes sense. And then what happens immediately then is they show up unexpectedly, and you're like, even if I dotted all my I's and crossed my T's, there's still a chance that I might have missed something, right? And so everybody's in a panic because they're like, after this, I'm going to jail. There's no way I'm getting out of this alive. My career's over. They're going to call all my clients and say this person's a shyster. I almost expected at one point that the shredding machines were going to be fired up. They're just be like, all right, let's put it in there. Get it out of here. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, as it turned out, nobody went to jail, and they were like, everything was fine. was terrifying, right? They were there for 2 weeks, you know. And they take a conference room over, and they just, take a look at this file and that file. And in a lot of ways, that's sort of that fear is what people think of in the second coming, right? Like they're like, wow, when Jesus comes back, he's going to audit all my books, you know, and if I've made any mistakes, then I'm going straight down to hell, you know, and that's what a lot of people think. And I'm not saying it's without warrant, but I think that there's another way to think about Christ coming back for us. And I think of it like this. This is another personal story. When I was a kid, my grandparents, every now and again, would say they're coming down to visit. They lived in Raritan, New Jersey. And, you know, they'd say, we'll be there on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. You know, we'll be there. And, you know, my mom and dad and I knew that, that's probably not going to happen. Because, I mean, my grandfather's Lincoln, it's huge, it's a gas guzzler, it only goes 35 miles an hour. You know, I mean, it could go more than 35, but he wouldn't go more than 35. And he'd have his, polkas on, because they're Polish, my grandmother and grandfather. And on the way down, they'd stop at stores, and they'd just pick up a ton of stuff for me, because I was an only child, and, woo, it's great to be my child. And so they picked up all this stuff, and, it would delay their coming. They would just take a while. And then, they'd finally, show up late. And we kind of expected it. Sometimes they'd show up on Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning. Or, of course, if we had a lot of house cleaning to do, they'd show up early. So that's kind of how it worked with my grandparents. But I think that image of a loving parent, bearing gifts, is closer to the second coming of Christ that we're presented with today. The Christ who says each week you are forgiven. I gave myself for you. Or the Christ who in baptism says, you will have a resurrection like mine. Or the Christ in the confession and forgiveness. Jesus Christ died for us, and God forgives us on his account. This is the Christ that we know. So when we hear about, in the gospel reading today, Noah said, in the story about Noah, it says everybody's, they're drinking, having fun, merrymaking, given in marriage, marrying. That's sort of everyday stuff, right? And then you have the workers in the field. And one is taken and one isn't. And then you have the women preparing meals. And one is taken and one isn't. So if they're all doing the same work, then the reason they're taken has to be something else, right? And I think that reason is faith. Because when you hear about the owner of the house, and he fell asleep, he wasn't watchful, and he allowed the thief to come in and plunder his house. What if he was watchful? What if he was awake? Then the thief wouldn't come. If he had faith that someone was going to come, he believed that perhaps somebody might come at night. You see, that's the thrust of the second coming. It's less about where we're going, but rather how we live today. What might we do different if we thought Jesus was coming at 10:30, for example? Not out of fear, but because our loving parent is coming to us bearing gifts. How do we prepare? See, that's what Advent is about. It's about watchfulness. Waiting for the Savior who gave his life for all of us. Not out of fear, but out of joy, because it's a promise, not a threat. So thank God for Christ who comes for us, who came for us on the cross and who promises to come again, bearing the same